Most of us thinks that a world map is permanent because of its clean lines, clear borders, and fixed countries. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of those lines were drawn by men who had never set foot on the land they were dividing. They didn't speak the languages. They didn't understand the cultures. They didn't care who hated who or who depended on who to survive. They cared about power, control, and empire. Today, wars rage in places that seem eternally unstable. The Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. We're often told these conflicts are ancient, tribal, and religious. But buried beneath the headlines is a quieter, more disturbing cause. The borders themselves were designed to fail. In today's episode of The Stories They Buried, I will tell you how Britain drew borders that still bleed, and how decisions made in London over a century ago continue to kill people today.
Company! Forward! March!
The British Empire controlled nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface at its peak, from the Caribbean to Africa, from the Middle East to South Asia. Britain didn't just rule territories, it reorganized them. Maps became weapons. Borders were drawn to divide resistance, to reward allies, to secure trade routes, to extract resources. And when Britain left, it rarely fixed the damage. Instead, it handed independence to countries with borders that guaranteed tension. The empire ended, but conflicts didn't. During World War I, Britain and France secretly agreed to carve up the collapsing Ottoman Empire. The people living there were never consulted. In London and Paris, diplomats took rulers and pencils and drew straight lines across deserts. That agreement created modern Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. In Iraq, Britain merged Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds. Three groups with different histories, loyalties, and grievances. They were merged regardless, and the result was rebellions, coups, dictatorship, civil war, and extremism. When ISIS emerged, many asked, why is Iraq so unstable? The answer was buried in a map drawn in 1916. Another good example in the Middle East is Palestine, a promise Britain couldn't keep. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration. It promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a land already inhabited by Arab Palestinians. Britain promised the same land to two different groups, and then walked away. The result was decades of war, displacement, occupation, and cycles of violence that never end. The conflict is often framed as religious, but at its core, it's a colonial border problem that was never resolved. Now, let's go to Africa. If you want to understand Africa's conflicts, look at the map. You will notice how many borders are perfectly straight. Nature doesn't work like that. People don't either. In 1884, European powers met in Berlin in what is called Berlin Conference. No Africans were invited. They divided the continent among themselves like property. Ethnic groups were split across borders, forced into rival states, ruled by minorities favored by colonial powers. In Nigeria, for instance, Britain merged House of Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo, groups with different religions, political systems, and histories. The result was the Biafran War, military coups, and ethnic tensions that still shape their politics. Britain left in 1960, but the fractures remained. Sudan is another case. One country, two realities. Britain ruled Sudan as one territory, despite a largely Arab Muslim north and a largely African Christian/animist south. They governed them separately, then forced them together at independence. Decades of civil war followed. In 2011, South Sudan finally became independent, but the damage was already done. Civil war erupted inside the new country. Borders don't heal trauma, they preserve it. In Asia, as Britain prepared to leave India, it rushed the process. One man, Cyril Radcliffe, was tasked with drawing the borders. He had never been to India before. He was given 5 weeks. The result was the partition of India. Millions displaced, over 1 million dead, families cut in half, villages turned into killing fields. And the border dispute over Kashmir remains one of the most dangerous flashpoints on Earth between two nuclear-armed nations. This wasn't inevitable. It was rushed, careless, and catastrophic. By the time Britain officially left its colonies, the damage had already been done. The flags were lowered. The governors packed their bags. But the borders stayed, and unlike armies, borders don't leave. They sit quietly, waiting. Across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, newly independent nations inherited maps that made no sense. Maps designed not for peace, but for control. Britain didn't need to rule these countries anymore. The borders would do the job for them. New leaders were handed impossible states. In Nigeria, one government was expected to rule over hundreds of ethnic groups, dozens of languages, deep religious divisions, all forced into one country because it was administratively convenient for Britain. In Sudan, British borders stitched together Arab Muslims in the north and African Christians and animists in the south, groups with no shared political history. For decades, Sudan burned from the inside. Eventually, it split. But even that split didn't bring peace, because the borders were wrong from the beginning. Nowhere is the legacy clearer than in the Middle East. Britain and France carved the region not based on history, but on oil routes, trade access, and military advantage. Merging groups who had histories of tension was sabotage. The British knew this, and they did it anyway, because divided societies are easier to control than united ones. Even today, every conflict in Iraq traces back to that original decision. In Palestine, Britain didn't fulfill its promise. It promised Arabs independence. It promised Jews a homeland. It delivered neither, only division. The British withdrawal didn't solve the conflict. It triggered it. What followed were decades of war, displacement, occupation, and bloodshed. A conflict that did not begin with ancient hatred, but with colonial indecision and political convenience. In 1947, Britain rushed its exit from India. A man who had never been to India was given 5 weeks to draw a border. 5 weeks. India and Pakistan split overnight. 14 million displaced. Up to 1 million killed. Families were cut in half. Village burned. Train cars arrived full of bodies. This wasn't chaos. It was a predictable outcome of reckless borders. And today, India and Pakistan still stand on the edge of nuclear war, all because of one hurried line. Britain didn't only draw destructive borders abroad, it did at home too. To protect British interests and loyalists, Britain partitioned Ireland. Northern Ireland remained part of the UK. The rest became independent. That line sparked decades of sectarian violence. The Troubles, bombings, assassinations. Peace came only after immense suffering. And even today, Brexit reopened old wounds. Borders don't disappear. They wait. This wasn't incompetence. It was a strategy. Britain used divide and rule, fragment unity, prevent rebellion, maintain influence after withdrawal. Unstable borders meant continued dependency, military access, political leverage. Even after independence, Britain often backed friendly elites, supported certain groups, sold arms into fragile regions. The empire left. But the system remained. When violence erupts today, we're told, they've always hated each other. It's tribal. It's religious. That story is convenient, because it removes responsibility. But many of these conflicts began in the 20th century because of colonial borders that align with imperial interests. The hatred isn't ancient. The borders are. Changing borders is dangerous, but ignoring their origins is worse. True stability requires honest history, accountability, local self-determination. Yet former empires rarely admit the damage, because doing so would raise uncomfortable questions about reparations, about responsibility, about power. Borders are not neutral. They carry the fingerprints of those who drew them. Britain ruled the world with maps, and the world still lives with the consequences. Every time violence erupts in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, we should ask a deeper question. Who drew this line, and why? Because until we confront the past honestly, the wars of the present will never truly end. This wasn't chaos. It was policy, and this is one of the stories they buried.